Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Thinking about home defense, there was an incident last summer up in Challis, Idaho, that makes for a really poignant case study, or at least I think it does. I don't have all the facts, all the details about what actually happened, so for official purposes, what I'm going to tell you is a hypothetical situation. It's something that could have happened. It may or may not be quite what actually happened in Challis. Now, one thing I will say about what actually happened, I know there was at least briefly a rumor on social media that there had been like a school shooting or some sort of mass shooting, active shooter event up in Challis, and those rumors are completely false. You know, an honest headline for what had actually happened would read something like, "Police respond to altercation between neighbors, shots fired, no one hurt." That was the gist of what happened. Now, for my hypothetical scenario, let's picture a piece of vacant land near Challis, which, if you're not familiar with Challis, it is a relatively small town, I'd guess maybe 1,500 people, located about as close to the middle of nowhere as you can get in the continental 48 states. It's probably at least a 3-hour drive from Challis to the nearest big shopping center. So you picture this little town surrounded by relatively barren country, mostly public land, some BLM, some Forest Service. And on the outskirts of this small town, you have a ranch with some property that is unfenced, unposted, and more or less unused. It's got a little creek that flows across a portion of it, small stand of cottonwoods along the creek. Further downstream, that creek is diverted for irrigation and there's some pasture land, but there's kind of a chunk of land here that's not being used for anything. And some of the local youth have taken to camping on this vacant lot because it's a little getaway that's not very far away. And as far as they know, it's public land because there is a lot of public land around, and there's nothing on this parcel to indicate private ownership unless you go down to the county assessor's office and look at their maps, which your typical high school student is not going to do. Meanwhile, down in California or some other populous part of the country, there is a man who is looking to escape from what he sees as kind of the unraveling of society. He's got kind of a survivalist mindset, and he manages to purchase this parcel of land near Challis, Idaho. It's kind of a long, narrow parcel with the unused portion at one end and a small farmhouse at the other. So he moves in, he moves his family in, he starts fixing things up. He has intentions of, at some point, building or rebuilding fences around the whole property and potentially posting private property signs, but he hasn't gotten around to that yet. The one thing he has been able to do as far as fences are concerned is gather up some materials that were lying around, and he's piled some old fence posts kind of out on that far corner, but mostly he's been focused on working on the house. Well, one weekend, some high school students come out to their camping spot. They pitch a makeshift camp. They scout around for dead wood, and they find this pile of weathered old fence posts, so naturally they hack them up and start burning them in their campfire. Well, the landowner looks up from something he was doing on his property, and he sees way off in the far corner of his property there's a couple of vehicles parked and there appears to be a fire burning, and he thinks, what on earth is going on there? I better go investigate this. And so he goes off to investigate. He's carrying a concealed handgun, and he confronts these teenagers. Of course, the teenagers think that they're camping on public land. They think that they're well within their rights, and so they don't respond real well to the landowner confronting them. They tell him that it's a free country, they've got every right to be here, and if he doesn't like it, he can get lost. Well, the landowner tries to set them straight. He tells them rather tersely that this is private property and that they are trespassing. At that point, two of the bolder boys kind of swagger up to him and say, well, what you gonna do about it? At this point, I should also point out that some of the other teenagers in the group are armed with .22 caliber rifles that they brought along for shooting rabbits and plinking and the kind of thing that teenage boys do when they're camping in Idaho. Well, the landowner is outnumbered about 5 to 1. He feels that he's being threatened with bodily harm by these boys, and he can see that at least some of them are armed. So at this point, he draws his pistol and fires around into the ground at their feet. At that point, the teenagers scramble into their vehicles and take off. But as they're retreating, they yell something to the effect of, "You haven't seen the last of us, we'll be back, just you wait till our parents find out about this, you're a dead man." The landowner takes their threat seriously. So first thing he does, he gets out his phone and he calls the sheriff. Reports the incident from his perspective, of course. The sheriff listens to his account. He kind of knows these kids, he knows their parents. It's a small town, he knows everybody. He doesn't think that these kids would actually hurt anybody, so he doesn't see this as an emergency that he needs to respond to. He figures he'll let tempers simmer down for a few days, and then when it's convenient to do so, he'll go talk to some people. Talk to the kids, talk to the parents, go back and talk to the landowner again, and get to the bottom of what really happened and try to smooth things out or take whatever actions the situation really warrants. So the landowner gets off the phone with the sheriff's assurance that he will look into it, feeling like he cannot depend on local law enforcement to rescue him in the event that these kids or their parents do in fact come back and try to kill him. So he goes back to his house, locks the doors, bars the windows, gets his wife and kid down to the basement, stages weapons and ammunition at strategic firing points around the house, and waits. Meanwhile, the kids run back to their parents and tell them that they were shot at out at their camping site by some crazy guy. The parents, of course, are incensed that anyone would threaten, let alone shoot at, their children, but they're also smart enough to realize that the kids are probably not telling the whole truth. And so they decide that they need to talk to this guy. They need to find out what really happened and determine, do we need to discipline our kids? Do we need to pay for something that they broke? Most likely, we can smooth this over if we just hear his side of the story and talk things out. At the same time, they're also aware that crazy people exist, and so they decide to go heavily armed just in case the kids are right about this guy being some lunatic who's out shooting at people. So the parents load up in a couple of SUVs, they go out to talk to this guy, they pull into the kids' camping spot, nobody's there, so they continue on down the gravel road toward the house. The homeowner, of course, is watching through binoculars. He sees them coming. Even at a distance, he can see these SUVs are practically bristling with AR-15s, so he jumps to the conclusion that the kids or their parents are indeed there to carry out that threat. And so as soon as they come within range, he puts a bullet through the windshield of the leading vehicle. The bullet goes through the windshield, misses the driver's head by a couple of inches, and is stopped by the headrest. At this point, the parents turn around, get out of there, and call the sheriff. This time, the sheriff sees it as an emergency, so he calls for backup from several neighboring counties as well as the state. Police surround the house, and then the homeowner surrenders without any further shooting. Now, what happened after the landowner was taken into custody? who knows? I doubt if the real case has made its way through the court system and been resolved yet, and for the purpose of our hypothetical, it really doesn't matter. What matters is that here we have a homeowner who, in a technical, tactical sense, did everything right. I mean, he had every right to confront trespassers and ask them to leave. He didn't deploy his firearm until he had reasonable cause to believe that his life was in imminent danger. And similarly, in the second altercation, he had reasonable cause to believe that his life was in imminent danger. And yet, despite doing everything right, he ended up looking like the bad guy. At the same time, who is the bad guy in this situation? I mean, the parents acted both reasonably in that they wanted to talk to this guy and get to the bottom of what really happened, and also prudently in that they came prepared to deal with a violent situation if he turned out to be as deranged as their kids had implied. In hindsight, maybe they should have been a little bit more prudent and also brought the sheriff with them to facilitate this discussion. Or alternatively, if their intent was to extend an olive branch, then maybe they shouldn't have gone so visibly armed. Take the rifles down off the gun rack and put them under the seat or something. At the same time, bear in mind that the parents didn't know that their kids had told the guy that they were going to come back and kill him. So they had no reason to expect him to be expecting an attack as he was, and to interpret their driving down his driveway in a vehicle that clearly contained firearms as a threatening incursion of enemy forces into his territory, as it were. And the parents are not the one who got arrested, so what they did was not perfect, but it was reasonable. If you had to pin the blame somewhere, it would probably be on the teenagers who created this misunderstanding that escalated so quickly. But all they really did was mouth off to an adult and make some empty threats because they were trying to talk tough because they were probably kind of scared. Which, while it's certainly not good behavior, is exactly the kind of behavior that you would expect from people of that age group. So getting back to the homeowner's perspective, how could he have done things differently to avoid ending up looking like the bad guy in this altercation? From a tactical perspective, there's not really much that he could have done differently. I mean, when he was first confronted by the teenagers, if they had been intent on beating him up and shooting him, then if he hadn't drawn his gun when he did, if he hadn't taken those steps to defend himself, he would have ended up dead. Similarly, if the parents really had been coming back to kill him, as he believed they were based on what the kids had told him, and he hadn't opened fire when he did, then he would have ended up dead. So he really used the minimum force necessary to protect himself in the situation as best he understood it in both cases. So it's hard to find fault with his tactics. The problem here is not a tactical one, but really a strategic one, or perhaps I should say the problem is a deficiency of strategic thinking. As you know, tactics is about how to win a battle or survive an incident. Strategy is what determines which battles you actually fight. So in this case, you've got a homeowner moving to a new area. Strategically, he should have recognized that anytime you relocate, you become an outsider. And so you have to build or rebuild your network of alliances in your new location. I mean, there's a lot of good moral and civic and other reasons to make friends with your neighbors and get involved in your community, but just from a purely strategic survival standpoint, If you think, what if some natural disaster suddenly plunged your area into anarchy? Would your neighbors be allies that you could count on for help? Or enemies that would be raiding you? Or would you be starting from scratch as a total stranger trying to figure out who's a friend and who's a foe? Or, in our scenario here, what if the landowner had established enough connections in his community that when he first confronted the kids camping on his land, at least one of them looked familiar. And he could say, hey, aren't you so-and-so's kid? I think I know your dad. Does he know that you're here? Does he know that you're out here burning my fence posts? That would have set a very different tone for that encounter. Or even if he hadn't made that specific connection to know one of these kids or their parents personally, what if he'd at least gathered enough intel on his new environment to know that these kids probably did not represent the kind of criminal, low-life gang activity that he may have been used to back where he came from? No, they were somebody's beloved and relatively harmless children. That knowledge would potentially have enabled him to handle the confrontation with the kids differently and prevent it from escalating the way it did. Or maybe he hadn't been there long enough to really make many connections within the community, but he had reached out to a few of his nearest neighbors, and so he's got a phone number for one old-timer who kind of knows everybody in the community. And so when he sees the vehicles and the fire on the corner of his property, he recognizes that he doesn't have a lot of intel on this situation yet, and he wants to gather more information before he confronts them. And so he calls up his one contact and says, hey, there's an old blue Chevy pickup and a white Jeep parked out on the corner of my property. Do you know whose those might be? And starts that conversation so he can gather a little more information on what's going on before he initiates that contact. Again, just having a little bit more information that allowed him to understand the situation that he was getting into better might have changed how he approached it and enabled him to handle it in a way that it would not have escalated the way it did. So, having had several months to ponder this scenario since last summer, I think the big takeaway that I see here is the importance of budgeting time for strategic thought and preparation and not just tactical preparation. So things like gathering information, developing alliances in the community, and sort of planning several moves out so that I'm not just surviving a situation, but I'm securing the future. Anyway, just something I'd been thinking about and thought I'd share it with y'all. So, till next time, thanks for watching the Idahoan Show.